The young star pointed at the old man in the worn leather jacket and told the crowd on the red carpet that someone had let a thief walk in off the street. It happened at the valet circle in front of the Hollywood premiere, under a wall of camera flashes, and the old man had just stepped out of a rare vintage Rolls-Royce, a car so unusual that half the photographers had turned to shoot it before they shot the stars. He was dressed the way he always dressed, a faded brown leather jacket gone soft at the elbows, a plain dark shirt, jeans, an old baseball cap pulled low, and to the young star, Tyler Ashford, 28 years old and certain of everything, the picture did not add up, because in Tyler's understanding of the world, a man who dressed like that did not own a car like that, and so there was only one explanation, and Tyler said it loudly enough for the reporters to hear. He said that some nobody had clearly stolen that car or been hired to park it, and was now strolling around the premiere like he belonged, and that somebody should call security. And when a valet tried to quietly tell him he was mistaken, Tyler waved him off and took out his own phone and called a man his family knew in the police department directly, and said there was a vehicle theft in progress and a suspicious man refusing to leave. What Tyler Ashford did not know, because he had never once in his life bothered to learn the faces of the people who came before him, was that the man in the worn jacket had been invited to that premiere as a guest of honor, that the studio had flown him in to be celebrated, that every camera turning toward the Rolls-Royce was turning because the photographers, the valets, the publicists, and most of the crowd had already recognized exactly who he was, and were watching, with a slowly building horror, as a 28-year-old called the police on him. His name was Keanu Reeves, and before this night was over, the young star who had everything, the famous name, the powerful family, the certainty that the world was arranged for his benefit, would lose nearly all of it, not because Keanu Reeves did anything to him, but because Tyler Ashford could not stop, would not stop, was constitutionally incapable of stopping, until he had buried himself completely on camera, in front of the entire industry he wanted so badly to rule. But to understand how a young man destroys himself in 20 minutes on a red carpet, you have to understand both of them first. And you have to understand the car. Because the car is the center of all of it, and the car belonged, in every way that mattered, to a man who had been dead for many years. Let me take you back, and let me start with the car, because the car is where the heart of this is. The Rolls-Royce was a 1965 Silver Cloud, and it was, in the specific configuration it had left the factory in, very close to one of a kind, a special order car built for a buyer who had wanted certain things done by hand that were almost never done, and it had passed through a small number of owners over 60 years, and had become, in the world of people who care about such things, a quietly legendary automobile, the kind that surfaces at a major auction once a decade and disappears again into a private collection. Keanu Reeves had bought it at one of those auctions about 3 years before this story, and he had paid a great deal of money for it, more than he had ever spent on anything for himself. And he had done it for a reason that had nothing to do with cars, and everything to do with a man named Vernon Reeves, who was not his real father in the literal sense of the public record, but who in this story is the father, the man who raised him. And you should understand him before you understand why a quiet man would pay a fortune for a machine he rarely drove. Vernon had been a mechanic. He had spent 40 years under the hoods of other people's cars, in a cinder-block garage that smelled of motor oil and cold coffee, with hands that never fully came clean, no matter how hard he scrubbed. And he had loved automobiles the way some men love music, as a thing of beauty he could take apart and understand and put back together. And the most beautiful car Vernon Reeves ever saw in his life was a 1965 Silver Cloud that came into his garage exactly once, in the winter of 1974, belonging to a wealthy man passing through town who needed a repair Vernon could do, and the dealerships could not. It is worth sitting in that garage for a moment, because everything that happened on the red carpet decades later was set in motion there. Vernon Reeves had not had an easy life and had not expected one. He had come up poor and stayed working class, had raised his family on what a good mechanic could earn, which was enough to keep them fed and housed and not much more, and he had made his peace with the size of his life, in the way that dignified men of that generation did, not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet accounting, a clear-eyed understanding of what was available to a man like him, and what was not. He took an enormous and genuine pride in his work. He could diagnose an engine by sound, could feel a problem through the steering wheel that 3 other mechanics had missed. And the wealthy men whose cars fixed often did not know, and never asked that the man with the dirty hands knew more about the machines they owned than they ever would. Vernon did not resent them exactly. He simply understood that there was a line, invisible and absolute, between the men who owned the beautiful things and the men who maintained them, and that he had been born on the maintaining side of it, and that the line did not move. The winter the silver cloud came in, Vernon spent 2 days with that car, and his son, who was a boy then, came to the garage after school and watched his father work on it, with a reverence the boy had never seen in him before. Vernon handled that car the way a man handles something holy. He ran his hands along the hand-finished walnut of the dashboard. He opened and closed the heavy doors over and over, just to feel the engineering of them, the way they sealed shut with a sound like a vault. He showed the boy the things most people would never notice, the quality of the leather, the precision of the seams, the way everything had been done by a human hand that cared. And he talked about it for the rest of his life. And at the end of those 2 days, when the wealthy stranger came to collect the car and paid the bill and drove away without learning the name of the man who had fixed what no one else could, Vernon had stood in the doorway of his garage and watched the silver cloud disappear down the road, and he had said to his son, not sadly, just truthfully, that a man like him would work on a car like that, would know it better than its owner ever would, but would never sit in one as its own master, because some things were built for one kind of person and admired by another, and that this was simply the way the world was sorted. He said it the way you say a thing you have made your peace with. And his son, who was a boy then, hanging around the garage handing his father wrenches, had heard him say it and had never forgotten it and had carried it for 40 years. The image of his father in oil-stained coveralls standing back from a car he could fix but could never have, saying that some things were not built for men like him. So when that exact car, the 1965 Silver Cloud, the legend, came up for auction 3 years before this story, Keanu Reeves bought it. Vernon was years dead by then. He never saw it. He never sat in it. And that precisely was the point, because Keanu had not bought the car to drive it or to show it or to own it in any way that was about himself. He had bought it because his father had stood in a cold garage in 1974 and decided that a car like that was not built for a man like him, and Keanu had wanted, with a need that he could not fully explain even to himself, to prove the old man wrong, to make the thing his father admired from a distance belong. Finally, to Vernon's family, to put the boy who handed his father wrenches into the driver's seat of the one car Vernon had loved and could never have. He kept it in a climate-controlled garage. He almost never drove it. And a few times a year, on certain days, he took it out alone and drove it slowly through the hills with the windows down, not because he needed to go anywhere, but because it was the closest he could get to giving his father a ride he never took. And on those drives he talked to Vernon, out loud, sometimes in the privacy of the car his father had loved, and that was the entire reason the Rolls-Royce existed in his life. And it is a reason that Tyler Ashford, screaming about a thief on a red carpet, could not have imagined in 1,000 years. The night of the premiere was one of those certain days. It would have been Vernon's birthday. That is why Keanu drove the Rolls that night, instead of the old pickup truck he usually drove, the truck that was more truly his daily life, dented and unwashed, with a toolbox rattling in the bed. He had been invited to the premiere weeks earlier, a film he had a small but real connection to, and he had agreed to come as a guest of honor, one of those evenings where the industry celebrates someone who has been around long enough and behaved well enough to be worth celebrating, and ordinarily he would have come quietly in the truck and slipped in a side door, because that was his way. But the premiere fell on Vernon's birthday, and so he had taken the silver cloud out of its garage and dressed the way he always dressed, in the worn jacket and the cap, because the clothes had nothing to do with the car. The clothes were just him, and he had driven his father's dream car to the event in his father's honor, intending to spend the evening half present and half somewhere else, with a man who had been dead a long time, in a car that closed like a bank vault. He did not know that the most arrogant young man in Hollywood was going to be standing at the valet circle when he arrived. Now let me tell you about Tyler Ashford, and let me be fair to him, because the easy version of this story makes him a cartoon, and the true version is more useful and more frightening. Tyler Ashford was 28 years old, and he was, by every external measure, winning. He was genuinely talented, which matters, because the most dangerous arrogance is the kind with some real ability underneath it to fertilize it. He had a face the camera loved, and an ease in front of it that could not be taught, and he had ridden those gifts, and something else, to the top of the rising generation of stars, his name above the title of a major film for the first time. This very film, the one premiering tonight, his big arrival. And the something else, the accelerant, was his family. Tyler was the son of Lawrence Ashford, a man who had spent 30 years becoming one of the most powerful figures in the entertainment business, a producer and financier and power broker, whose name opened any door in town. And Tyler had grown up inside that power the way a fish grows up inside water, so completely surrounded by it that he could not perceive it as a thing separate from himself. He had never once in his life experienced a closed door. He had never been told no by anyone who could make it stick. He had been raised, with total consistency, in the belief that the Ashfords were a certain kind of person, and the world was sorted into those who mattered and those who served. And he had absorbed that belief so deeply that he did not experience it as a belief at all, but simply as the way reality was shaped. And out of that upbringing came the specific flaw that would destroy him, which was not cruelty exactly, though it produced cruelty, but a complete incuriosity about other people, a bone-deep conviction that other people were either useful, decorative, or irrelevant, and that there was no fourth category and no reason to look closer. This is worth understanding precisely, because incuriosity does not look like a sin, and that is what makes it so dangerous. Tyler was not, in the ordinary sense, a hateful person. He did not lie awake plotting harm. He was something more modern and more common, a person for whom other human beings had simply never become fully real, because nothing in his life had ever required them to. The grips who built the sets he performed on, the drivers who delivered him to them, the assistants who managed his hours, and the older actors who had spent 40 years learning the craft he had been handed in too, all of them existed for Tyler in a kind of soft focus, present but not vivid, functional but not real, scenery in the film of his own importance. He had never had to know them, because he had never needed anything from them that was not simply given, and so he had never developed the muscle that the rest of us develop through necessity, the muscle that lets you imagine that the person in front of you has an interior as full and as urgent as your own. That muscle, in Tyler Ashford, had simply never grown, and a man without it can walk through the world doing tremendous damage while feeling, the entire time, like the reasonable one. Because the people he damages are not quite real enough to him to register as wounded. Tyler did not learn the names of older actors, because in his understanding older actors were finished, used up yesterday, and the entire orientation of his attention was forward and upward toward the people who could lift him higher, never backward or down toward the people who had built the thing he was climbing. He genuinely did not know who Keanu Reeves was in any meaningful sense. He had a vague awareness of the name the way you have a vague awareness of a mountain range you have never visited, but he had never watched the films, never studied the career, never absorbed the thing that everyone else in that industry knew, which was that Keanu Reeves was not just a star, but something rarer, a man revered across the entire business for his work, and, even more, for his decency, for 30 years of treating every crew member and every nobody exactly the way he treated the powerful. A man whose kindness was so well documented it had become a kind of industry legend. Everyone knew this. It was common knowledge. It was, you might say, the single most well-known fact about the man. And Tyler Ashford did not know it, because Tyler Ashford had never once thought it worth his time to look backward at the people who came before him, and that incuriosity, that arrogant refusal to know, was the loaded gun he would point at his own head on the red carpet. There was one more thing about Tyler, and it is the thing that turned a bad encounter into a catastrophe, and it is about the car. Tyler collected things, rare things, old things, expensive things, the trophies of a young man who had learned to measure human worth in acquisitions. And he had a particular hunger for cars, and he had known about the 1965 Silver Cloud, the legendary one, because everyone in his collecting world had known it was coming up for auction 3 years earlier. Tyler had wanted it. He had wanted it badly, with the specific covetousness of a man who has been taught that wanting a thing and deserving it are the same, and he had fully intended to buy it, had told people he was going to buy it, had let it be known that the car would be his. There is a particular kind of damage that the word no does to a person who has never heard it, and Tyler's relationship to the Silver Cloud was a perfect specimen of it. He did not love cars the way Vernon Reeves had loved them, as things of beauty to be understood. He loved them the way he loved everything, as extensions of himself, as evidence of his own importance made visible and ownable. And the rarer the object, the more completely it confirmed that he was the kind of person rare things came to. The Silver Cloud was the rarest of all, the one car his collecting circle spoke about in hushed tones, and Tyler had decided, with the casual certainty of a man who had never wanted anything he could not have, that it would join his collection, that the story of his life would include the sentence about the time he acquired the legendary one. And he had already, in his mind, owned it, had already enjoyed the owning of it, before the auction ever happened. And then a tour had taken him out of the country on the auction date, a scheduling conflict he could not move, and he had left instructions for someone to bid for him, and the bidding had gone higher than he had authorized. And by the time he could be reached, the car was gone, sold to an anonymous private buyer, vanished into someone else's collection, and Tyler Ashford had never gotten over it. It was the rare thing he had wanted and not gotten, the one no in a life of yeses, and it had festered in him for 3 years. Because men like Tyler do not experience a loss as a normal part of life, they experience it as a theft, as something owed to them that the world had wrongly withheld. And underneath the festering was a darker thing still, the thing that turns a spoiled man into a dangerous one, which is that when a person like Tyler cannot have the thing he wants, the wanting curdles into a need to see it ruined, to deny it to whoever did get it. Because if he cannot possess the beautiful object, then at least he can refuse to let it belong, in peace, to someone else. He had not known who bought the car. He had spent 3 years resenting a faceless stranger, and on the night of the premiere, the stranger acquired a face, the worst possible face for Tyler's purposes, the face of a man in a worn jacket who looked, to Tyler, like exactly the kind of nobody who had no business owning what Tyler had been denied. And every drop of 3 years of curdled wanting found, in that instant, a target it believed it could destroy. You have to understand what that did to him, because it is the engine of the whole night. It was not only that a man who looked poor was driving an expensive car, which would have been enough to trigger Tyler's class contempt all on its own. It was that this shabby nobody was driving the specific car that Tyler believed had been stolen from him. The car he had wanted and lost, the open wound, and the sight of it detonated something. In that instant, Tyler did not see a man arriving at a premiere. He saw an insult. He saw the universe rubbing his face in the one thing he could not have, and he saw it being rubbed in his face by someone he had instantly, automatically, on the basis of a worn jacket, sorted into the category of people who do not matter. And the combination of those two things, the class contempt and the personal grievance, produced a rage that needed somewhere to go. And it went exactly where you would expect a powerful man's rage to go when it is aimed at someone he believes is powerless. It went toward destruction. Keanu had handed the keys to the valet, a young man named Hector, who had taken one look at the driver and then the car and gone slightly pale with recognition and said, very quietly, "It's an honor, sir." And Keanu had nodded and said thank you and started toward the entrance. And that was when Tyler's voice came across the valet circle. "Hey, hey, you, where do you think you're going?" Keanu stopped. He turned. He saw a young man he did not recognize, in a suit that cost more than the valet made in 3 months, walking toward him with the particular stride of a person who has never had to wonder whether he is allowed to approach someone. Keanu said nothing, just waited the way he had learned to wait a long time ago. "That car," Tyler said, pointing at the silver cloud. "Where did you get that car?" "It's mine," Keanu said. And Tyler laughed, a sharp, ugly laugh, and turned to the small crowd that was already forming the way crowds form and said loud, "Yours." "Right. A guy dressed like you. That's a one-of-a-kind car, pal. I know exactly what that car is, and there's no way in hell it belongs to somebody who shops at a thrift store. So let's try again. Who'd you steal it from? Or are you just the help they sent to park it?" "The valet." Hector took a step forward and said, "Mr. Ashford, sir? That's, you don't understand. That's," and Tyler rounded on him and told him to shut up and get back to his stand before he had him fired. And Hector, 23 years old, 6 months into a job he could not afford to lose, fell silent. And the silence of the people who knew the truth and were too frightened to say it would become one of the textures of the whole evening, the same way it always does. Keanu looked at Tyler for a moment. He could have ended it right there. He could have said his own name, 3 syllables, and watched the young man's certainty collapse. But that had never been his way, and saying his name to defend himself would have meant defending himself the way the powerful do, by pulling rank, by being important, and Keanu had spent his entire life refusing to be important at people, refusing to make his name a weapon, because he remembered a cinderblock garage and a man in oil-stained coveralls who had no name to pull. And he was not going to become, on his dead father's birthday, in his dead father's car, the kind of man who solved a problem by announcing how much he mattered. So he did not say his name. He said quietly the only thing he was willing to say. "This is a small town." And he turned to go inside. It was a strange thing to say, and Tyler did not understand it, and he was not meant to understand it, not yet. It was not a threat. It was something truer and quieter than a threat. The industry is a small town. Everyone in it knows everyone. And the town has a long memory, and it remembers exactly how you treat the people you think are beneath you. And Keanu had said it, the way you state a fact to someone about to learn it the hard way. Almost with a kind of mercy, a last small door left open. But Tyler did not walk through the door. Tyler, hearing what he took to be a vague little man muttering something at him, felt his rage spike, because nothing enraged him like being unbothered at, like a target who would not perform the fear he was owed. And he did the thing his whole life had taught him to do when he wanted something to happen. He reached for his power. He took out his phone, and he did not call the front desk or club security or the premier's own staff. He called a number in his contacts. A man named Commander Walsh, a senior officer in the city police, whom Lawrence Ashford had cultivated for years the way powerful men cultivate useful officials. A man who had been to Ashford parties and accepted Ashford favors. And Tyler said, "Hey, it's Tyler Ashford, Lawrence's son. Listen, I need a unit at the premiere right now. There's a guy who stole a car, and he's refusing to leave. He's being aggressive. I think he's dangerous. Can you get someone here fast?" And Commander Walsh, who understood exactly what kind of call this was and exactly whose son was making it, said he would have officers there in 5 minutes, and he did. And that is the moment the night turned from an ugly encounter into something that could not be taken back, because Tyler Ashford had now used the machinery of state power, summoned through a family connection, to have an innocent man detained, and he had done it loudly, on a red carpet, in front of cameras, and there was no version of the next hour in which that fact did not eventually surface and define him. The police arrived in 2 cars, no sirens but lights flashing, and they came up the premier's service drive and parked at the valet circle, and 2 officers got out, and the senior one, a heavyset man named Officer Doyle, who had been told by his commander to handle a situation for a friend of the department, walked straight toward Keanu without looking at anyone else, because he had already been told who the suspect was. And the suspect was the man in the worn jacket. And Officer Doyle said, "Sir, I need you to step away from the vehicle and keep your hands where I can see them." Keanu stopped. He turned slowly, hands visible, the practiced stillness of a man who had been in some version of this situation before. Not at a premiere, not with this car, but in the deep structure of it, the structure where a calm explanation is treated as resistance and a raised voice is treated as proof. He said, evenly, "This is my car, officer. I have the registration. My name is on it." But Doyle did not want the registration, not yet, because Doyle had not come there to investigate. He had come there to do a favor, and so instead of examining the documents Keanu was offering, he kept his hand near his belt and told Keanu to step back from the car. And Tyler, emboldened by the arrival of the power he had summoned, came up alongside the officer like a junior partner in the investigation and started narrating, "That's him. That's the guy. He's been acting crazy. He threatened me. He said I'd regret it. Look at him. Does he look like he owns a car like that to you? He threatened me. He said I'd regret it." None of it had happened. Keanu had said 6 words total. "This is my car," and "this is a small town," and none of them were a threat. But Tyler said the lie with the complete fluency of a person who had never in his life been contradicted, and that fluency was its own kind of evidence to a man like Doyle who wanted to believe it. And so the lie entered the record, and Keanu watched it enter, and his jaw tightened, and his hands stayed visible, and he did the thing he had taught himself to do over a lifetime, which was to breathe, slowly, and to understand with total clarity that his anger, however righteous, would be the thing they used against him, that one raised voice or one sharp gesture would transform him in an instant from a victim into a threat. And so he stood still, in his father's car, on his father's birthday, and he burned very quietly. And he said nothing that could be used. There was a moment in there, a single moment, where it nearly broke. It was when Tyler, warming to his own performance, gestured at the silver cloud and said to the officer that there was no way a bum like this could have come by a car like that honestly, that he had probably stolen it from some collection. That people like him ruined nice things. People like him ruined nice things. And something moved behind Keanu's eyes, because the car was not a nice thing. The car was his father. The car was a man in oil-stained coveralls who had been told his whole life that nice things were not built for men like him. And here was a child of privilege using that exact sorting, that exact line Vernon had stood on the wrong side of, as a weapon, and doing it over the very car Keanu had bought to erase that line. And for 1/2 of 1 second the discipline of a lifetime wavered, and Keanu felt the words rise in his throat. Felt the urge to tell this young man precisely what the car was, and precisely what his father had been, and precisely how small a thing it was to inherit power and call it merit. And then he did not. He swallowed it, the way Vernon had swallowed 40 years of the same thing, and he understood in that moment that the silence his father had taught him was not weakness, and had never been weakness. It was the dignity of a man who refuses to let the cruel decide who he is. And he let the urge pass through him and out of him, and his face went still again, and only Earl Tibbet, watching closely, saw what it had cost him, because Earl knew about the car. Now the crowd. The red carpet had been full, reporters and photographers and publicists, and the rising stars of the film all arranged along it in their finery, and the confrontation at the valet circle had drawn all of them. And the thing that made this different from an ordinary celebrity scuffle was that almost every single one of them knew who the man in the worn jacket was. The photographers knew, the veteran reporters knew, the publicists knew, the studio executives arriving knew and went pale. And so the crowd that gathered was not a crowd watching a thief get caught. It was a crowd watching in real time, with a slowly cresting wave of disbelief. A famous, arrogant young man called the police on Keanu Reeves, and they were watching it the way you watch a car, sliding toward a cliff in slow motion, and many of them had their phones out, because of course they did, And the phones were recording, and every phone was a witness. And Tyler, drunk on his own momentum, did not notice that the crowd was not on his side, did not notice the expressions, did not notice that the energy in the air was not the energy of a community watching justice, but the energy of a community watching a man destroy himself. Because Tyler had never in his life had to read a room, because rooms had always simply arranged themselves around him, and so he could not feel the floor tilting. There was a veteran in that crowd, a man worth naming because he tried. His name was Earl Tibbet, and he was 63 years old, and he had worked premieres and events in that town for over 30 years. Currently as the head of the Valley team for the company that staffed events like this one, and Earl had parked Keanu Reeves's cars on a dozen occasions over the years, including, twice, this exact Rolls-Royce. And Earl knew precisely whose car it was, and precisely who the man in the worn jacket was. And more than that, Earl's was one of the few people present who knew the other thing, the deep thing. Because years earlier, late at night at the end of a long event, Keanu had been waiting for his car, and he and Earl had fallen into the easy conversation that working men fall into. And Keanu had told him simply why he had bought the Silver Cloud, had told him about Vernon and the garage and the winter of 1974, and the car his father could fix but never have. One mechanic's son to a man who had spent his own life parking other people's cars, and Earl had never forgotten it. So when Earl Tibbet saw a 28-year-old in a $5,000 suit, screaming that Keanu Reeves had stolen the car he had bought to honor his dead father, something rose in Earl that was stronger than his fear for his job, and Earl walked over, and he said, to Officer Doyle, directly, with the steadiness of a man who has decided to speak, regardless of cost, "Officer, I can settle this right now. I know this man. I have parked that car for him personally more than once. That is Keanu Reeves, and that is his automobile, and I will stake 30 years of my reputation on it." And Officer Doyle, who had been sent to do a favor, looked at the old valet for about 2 seconds and said, "Stay back, sir. Let us handle this," and turned away, and dismissed 30 years of a man's word in the time it takes to exhale, because Earl Tibbet was a 63-year-old valet and his word, to a man doing a favor for a commander, weighed nothing. And Earl stood there with his dismissed truth and looked across the circle at Keanu, and Keanu looked back and gave him the smallest nod, a nod that said, "I see you. Thank you, I know what that cost you." The same nod that passes between people who have both learned what it is to be unheard. And Earl stepped back, his hands shaking slightly, and the injustice of it sat in his chest like a stone. Tyler, meanwhile, could feel that the situation was not resolving as fast as he wanted. And rather than letting that slow him down, it pushed him further, because Tyler Ashford had never developed the thing that would have saved him. The small internal voice that says, "You might be wrong. You should check. You should stop." That voice had been bred out of him by a lifetime of being right by default. So instead of pausing, he escalated, and he began to manufacture. He told Officer Doyle that he had seen the man earlier circling the parking area, looking into other cars, casing them, which was an invention. Keanu had driven straight up and handed off the keys. He said the man had reached into his jacket in a way that scared him, implying a weapon, which was an invention. He pulled out, piece by piece, the toolkit that powerful people use to convert their own bad behavior into someone else's crime. The casing, the aggression, the threat, the fear, and he laid it down with total confidence. And each invention was worse than the last, and each one was being recorded by 30 phones. And Tyler could not feel the catastrophe accumulating, because the catastrophe was made of other people's perceptions, and Tyler had never been able to perceive other people. There was a young woman on the carpet, one of the film's other rising stars, named Mara Quinn, 24 years old, in the middle of her own first big premiere. And she was watching this happen with a sick feeling that she would later say she could not shake. Mara knew who Keanu Reeves was. Everyone her age who actually cared about acting knew, because he was the one the serious one studied, the one whose decency was the example you were supposed to follow. And she stood there in her gown watching Tyler Ashford, the most powerful young man in her professional world, the son of Lawrence Ashford, a man who could make or end her career with a phone call, calling the police on Keanu Reeves and lying about him. And she felt the thing that Earl had felt, and that Hector the valet had felt, the pull to speak and the terror of the cost. And for several minutes, Mara Quinn did what almost everyone does in that moment, which was nothing, and she hated herself for it, even as she did it. And she stood frozen at the edge of the carpet with her phone in her hand, watching, not yet brave. The way most of us are not yet brave, right up until the moment we either become brave or live with not having been. Officer Doyle told Keanu to turn around and put his hands on the car. And here was the hinge of the night, the moment that could have gone the other way, because a man with less discipline, a man who had not spent a lifetime learning the cost of his own anger, would have refused in a way that gave them what they wanted. But Keanu Reeves had spent decades learning exactly this, and he understood the physics of the trap perfectly, and so he did not refuse in anger, and he did not comply in surrender. He said, clearly, loud enough for the phones to catch it, "Officer, I am not resisting, but I want it on the record that I have done nothing, that my registration is in my pocket, and that I am being detained because of how I am dressed and because that man wants this car." And then he turned slowly and put his hands on the Rolls-Royce, on his father's car, on his father's birthday, and let himself be detained for the theft of the thing he had bought to honor a dead man. And the cameras caught all of it, the worn jacket, the calm voice, the hands on the car, and that footage would be on every screen in the country within hours. He stood there with his hands on the car for a long time. The premiere had stopped. The whole machinery of the evening had ground to a halt because its guest of honor was bent over a Rolls-Royce in handcuffs that had not quite been applied. And inside the theater, the studio executives were in a quiet panic because they knew what the crowd knew, and one of them had already done the only sensible thing, which was to make a phone call of his own. Not to a police commander, but to the one person who could end this, a man named Marcus Bell. Now let me tell you about Marcus Bell, because he is the one who brings the documents. And the documents are the reckoning. Marcus Bell was Keanu's attorney and one of his oldest friends, a man he had known for 30 years, since before either of them had anything, and Marcus had built a career as one of the most respected entertainment lawyers in the city. And he happened to be at the premiere that night because he often was, and he had been inside when a white-faced studio executive found him and said, "You need to come outside right now. There is a situation with Keanu." And Marcus had walked out onto that carpet and taken in the entire scene. In about 3 seconds, the officers, the young man, the crowd, his friend bent over the car, and something had gone very cold and very still in Marcus Bell, and he had walked across the carpet with the unhurried deliberateness of a Manson who has just realized he is going to win completely. He did not raise his voice. He went first to Keanu and quietly asked if he was all right, and Keanu said he was fine, and Marcus said, "Good, stand up, this is over." And then Marcus Bell turned to Officer Doyle and introduced himself and said he was Mr. Reeves's attorney and that he had documentation that would resolve the matter immediately. And he opened a slim leather folio that he had asked an assistant to bring from his car. And he began, calmly, in a voice that carried, to lay out the truth. First, he said, the registration and title for the vehicle, a 1965 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud, registered owner Keanu Reeves, freaking clear, no liens, no disputes. He laid it on the hood. Second, the auction record from 3 years prior, documenting the purchase of that specific vehicle by Mr. Reeves, with the lot number and the date and the price, a matter of public record. He laid it down. The car was not stolen. The car had never been stolen. The car had been bought, legally and publicly, 3 years ago, by the man the police were currently detaining for stealing it. And then Marcus Bell turned, slowly, so that his voice would carry up the red carpet and across Valet Circle to every reporter and every camera and every frozen rising star. And he said the thing that ended Tyler Ashford's life as he had known it. He said, "The man you have detained, the man this young gentleman called the police on and accused of theft, is Keanu Reeves. He is the guest of honor at this premiere. The studio flew him in to celebrate him tonight, and the car he is accused of stealing is a car he bought at public auction 3 years ago to honor his late father. He turned and looked directly at Tyler. You called the police on Keanu Reeves at his own tribute over a car you were angry you didn't win. And every person here watched you do it. Silence, the specific silence that falls when a great many people realize at the same instant that they have just watched something irreversible. Up and down the carpet, the recognition completed itself, and you could see it move through the crowd like wind across a field, the understanding of exactly what had happened, and exactly who had done it, and exactly how completely it had been captured. The photographers were no longer shooting Keanu. They were shooting Tyler. They were shooting the face of a 28-year-old as the floor of his entire life dropped away beneath him. And Tyler Ashford, even then, even in that moment, did the thing that tells you everything about him, the thing that separates the people who can be saved from the people who cannot. He did not stop. He could not stop, faced with the complete and public collapse of his accusation. With the documents on the hood and the name spoken aloud, and the crowd turned against him, a person with any capacity for self-correction would have gone silent, would have begun the desperate work of apology. But Tyler had no such capacity, because he had never needed it, and so his cornered mind reached for the only tool it had ever known, which was the assertion of his power, and he said, his voice rising, loud, ugly, "I don't care who he is. He was driving my car. That car should have been mine. And you all know it? Do you have any idea who my father is? My father will bury every one of you. Do you have any idea who my father is?" He said it on a red carpet, into 30 phones, having just been told that the man he falsely accused was Keanu Reeves, and in that one sentence Tyler Ashford confirmed, for the entire watching world, that this had never been about a stolen car at all, that it had been about a spoiled young man's grievance over an auction he lost, and his bottomless certainty that his family's power placed him above consequence. And it was the single most damning thing he could possibly have said. And he said it because he could not say it, because the arrogance that had created the disaster was the same arrogance that made him incapable of surviving it. Keanu Reeves, standing now, the documents on the hood beside him, looked at Tyler for a long moment, and what was on his face was not triumph. It was something closer to a tired recognition, the look of a man who has seen this particular kind of young man before, and knows how the story ends and takes no pleasure in it. He did not gloat, he did not lecture. He picked up his keys from where the valet had set them, and he said to Tyler quietly, the last words he would say to him that night, "You should learn the names of the people who came before you." And then he handed the keys to Earl Tibbet, the old valet, the one who had tried, and asked him, "Would you bring it around, Earl?" And Earl Tibbet, his eyes wet, said it would be his honor, and the small kindness of that, the choosing of the dismissed old man to handle the precious car, was the only revenge Keanu took the entire night, and it was not revenge at all. It was just decency, pointed deliberately at the person who had earned it, in front of everyone who had watched the other thing. Officer Doyle was already retreating to his car. He did not apologize. The crowd was already turning into something else. 100 people on their phones, the footage already uploading, and Tyler Ashford was standing alone in the center of the red carpet, in his $5,000 suit, having just told the world who his father was, and he had never in his entire charmed life looked smaller. It took less than a day for it all to come apart. The first video was online within minutes, before Keanu had even left the building. A clean 2-minute clip shot from the carpet that caught everything: the accusation, the police, the documents, the name spoken aloud, and Tyler's final scream about his father. It did what those things do. By morning, it had tens of millions of views, and the phrase, "Do you have any idea who my father is?" had become a national joke, a meme, a shorthand for a certain kind of entitled collapse, and underneath the mockery ran a deeper and angrier current. Because what people had actually watched was a powerful young man weaponize the police against an innocent older one on the basis of nothing but a worn jacket and a personal grudge. And that, The casual deployment of state force as a tool of personal spite was the thing that did not blow over, because it was the thing that was true about more than just Tyler. The studio moved within hours. Tyler Ashford's film, the one that had premiered that very night, his arrival, his crowning, became radioactive overnight, and the studio, in full damage control, announced that it was minimizing his promotional involvement and quietly began exploring how much of his role in the franchise's future could be unwound, and the sequel that had been all but promised evaporated. The brands that had signed him, the watch company, and the fashion house, and the car manufacturer, all of whom had paid him to be the young face of their products, terminated their contracts within 48 hours. The morality clauses, activating one after another, like dominoes. And the endorsement income that had made up a large part of his wealth simply stopped. And then came the law, because what Tyler had done was not merely shameful. It was, in several specific ways, illegal. Marcus Bell, methodical and unhurried, filed a civil suit against Tyler Ashford personally for defamation, for the fabricated claims of threats and casing, and reaching for a weapon, statements Tyler had made to police, and which were demonstrably, provably false, captured on 30 cameras, and contradicted by every second of footage. It is worth understanding why those particular lies were the dangerous ones. Because there is a real principle underneath it that most people never have occasion to learn. There is a meaningful legal difference between being rude and filing a false report. Tyler could have stood on that carpet and called Keanu every contemptuous name he wanted, could have sneered at his jacket and his presumed Pavarotti all night long, and however ugly it would have been merely speech, the protected and worthless speech of a small man. But the moment he told a police officer that Keanu had threatened him, that he had been casing the lot, that he had reached for what might be a weapon, Tyler crossed a specific and bright line. Because those were not insults, they were allegations of crimes, made to law enforcement, designed to cause a man to be detained or arrested, and they were false. And Tyler knew they were false, and making them was itself a crime. To knowingly file a false police report, to make false statements to a peace officer in order to direct the power of the state against an innocent person, is not protected and is not trivial. It is an offense the law takes seriously, precisely because the alternative is a world in which anyone with a grievance can weaponize the police against anyone they dislike. And the whole fragile machinery of public safety becomes a tool of private spite. That is the line Tyler crossed, and he crossed it on camera, repeatedly, with elaboration, and that is why the rudeness blew over, and the false report did not. And separately, the district attorney's office, under enormous public pressure, and with a mountain of video evidence, brought criminal charges for filing a false police report and for making false statements to a peace officer. And the case was not difficult, because Tyler had performed his crimes in front of more cameras than most crimes are ever committed in front of. And his own words, his own inventions, were the evidence. And the family power that Tyler had reached for so casually, the power he had summoned with a phone call to Commander Walsh, turned out to be the thing that sank all of them, because that phone call did not stay hidden, and because the Ashfords, faced with a problem, did the only thing they had ever known how to do with a problem, which was to spend money at it until it went away. That instinct had always worked before. So, Lawrence Ashford went to work the way he had worked for 30 years, quietly, through intermediaries, with checkbooks and favors, and the soft pressure that powerful men apply to softer ones. A man from the family's law firm visited Hector, the young valet, and left an envelope and a suggestion that his memory of the evening was surely hazier than he thought. Calls were placed to the studio at a level above Tyler, reminding them of the films the Ashford money had financed and the films it might finance still, if certain things were allowed to fade. A representative reached out to Mara Quinn's management to explain, gently, how unwise a public statement would be for a young actress with a career ahead of her. And quietest of all, a sum of money moved toward Commander Walsh through a consulting arrangement that fooled no one who looked at it closely. in exchange for the incident report being written in a way that was kind to everyone but the man in the worn jacket. The Ashfords were not trying to win the argument. They were trying to make the argument disappear, the way they had made inconvenient things disappear for 3 decades, by purchasing the silence of everyone who could speak. It had always worked before. It did not work this time, and the reason it did not work is the reason the whole thing finally came down. Because every single person they tried to buy had just watched on their own phones exactly what the Ashfords did to people who would not cooperate. And the footage had made the cost of staying silent suddenly visible and enormous. Hector kept the envelope for one night and then drove to a lawyer's office and turned it over, cash and all, and signed a statement describing how it had been offered. Mara Quinn's manager forwarded the call to a reporter, and Commander Walsh, a careful man who had taken Ashford favors for years, looked at the size of the fire and decided he would rather testify than burn in it. And he took what he had, the texts, the consulting paperwork, the record of a 30-year relationship of quiet exchanged favors, to the prosecutors in return for his own softer landing. That was the second explosion, and it was far larger than the first. The premiere had been a scandal about one arrogant young man. What the bribery attempts detonated was a scandal about an entire enterprise because, once investigators had a thread, the thread did not stop at Tyler. It ran straight up into 30 years of how the Ashford machine actually worked. The cultivated officials, the suppressed complaints, the problems made to vanish, the favors banked and called in, and a grand jury began pulling on it. The charges, when they came, were no longer about a false report on a red carpet. They were about obstruction, about bribery, a public official, about a pattern. And they named not only Tyler but Lawrence and the family's lawyers, who had spent a career making things quiet, now found themselves unable to make the loudest thing of all quiet at all. And the empire that Lawrence Ashford had spent his life building came apart in public, the way these things do once the daylight gets in, slowly, and then all at once. Financing partners withdrew rather than be named in the coverage. The production company lost its projects, and then its credit, and then its standing. The cultivated friends, the useful officials, scattered, because the entire value of those relationships had always been their invisibility, and they were invisible no longer. The Ashford name, which had opened every door in the city for 30 years, became the name no one would return a call from. And the family that had tried to spend its way out of one boy's mistake discovered that they had instead spent the thing that could not be repurchased once it was gone, which was the quiet, and without the quiet, the machine could not run, and the machine was all they were. Lawrence Ashford did not lose his empire because his son insulted a man on a red carpet. He lost it because, when the cameras were already rolling, he reached for the only tool he had ever trusted, and that tool, in the light, was a crime. Tyler had screamed, "Do you have any idea who my father is?" Over the following months, he found out. His father was a man who, given the choice between his fortune and his son, had reached for the checkbook to save the son and lost the fortune anyway, and then had nothing left to protect either of them with, and the two of them ended up in the same sinking boat that the family money had been bailing for a generation, watching the water come in. A reporter named Nora Vance, a sharp and patient journalist who covered the industry, did the thing that turned a viral moment into a lasting reckoning. She started asking around. And what she found was that the night on the red carpet had not been an aberration, but a pattern. That Tyler Ashford had a long, quiet history of contempt for the people he considered beneath him. That there were crew members he had berated and humiliated, makeup artists and grips and drivers, older character actors he had treated like furniture, an entire trail of people he had been cruel to, precisely because they could not fight back, and Nora Vance found them, and some of them, seeing that the floor had finally tilted, were willing to talk cack. And her story, careful and devastating, established that the premiere was not the night Tyler Ashford became cruel. It was only the night he was cruel to someone who turned out to have more power than he did. And that distinction, the revelation, that his decency had always been purely a function of the other person's status, was the thing that finished him in the industry for good. Because an industry that is a small town with a long memory does not forgive the man who is kind only when it is useful. Mara Quinn, the young actress who had stood frozen at the edge of the carpet, did the thing she had not been brave enough to do in the moment. A few days later, when it cost her less, but still cost her something, she posted, publicly under her own name, a plain account of what she had witnessed, confirming that Keanu Reeves had been calm and respectful throughout, that Tyler's accusations had been fabricated, that she had watched him invent the threats, and she did it knowing that the Ashford family had been powerful and might still be, and the act of telling the truth on the record, late but not too late, became a small turning point in her own life. The moment she decided what kind of person she was going to be in that industry, and people noticed, the way the small town always notices, and her standing the right way when it was finally not quite safe to do so, did more for her over the following years than any amount of staying quiet ever could have. The criminal case ended in a plea. Tyler Ashford, on the advice of the lawyers his father was still grudgingly paying for, pleaded to the false report charges and was sentenced to probation and community service and a substantial fine, and the requirement that he complete a program, and his name went into the public record permanently attached to the words, "False police report, searchable forever." The first thing anyone would find about him for the rest of his life. The civil suit settled, the amount confidential but understood to be large, another permanent line in the ledger of what one night of arrogance had cost. He did not go to prison. The asymmetry of it, that a man who weaponized the police against an innocent person walked away with probation, was noted by many and was, in its way, its own small injustice. One more reminder that even in his fall, Tyler Ashford was cushioned by the residue of the privilege that had made him. But the career was gone, and the brands were gone, and the franchise was gone, and the protection of his father's name was gone, and the respect of the only town he had ever wanted to conquer was gone and was never coming back. And for a man who had measured his entire worth in those things, the loss of all of them at once was a kind of death. And here is the part that the story has been moving toward, the part that the cheap version leaves out, the private moment, alone, too late. Some weeks after it had all collapsed, Tyler Ashford sat alone in the house his father's money had bought, in a room full of the rare things he had spent his life accumulating, the watches and the art and the first editions, the trophies by which he had always measured the worth of a human being, and he watched the video. Not the way he had watched it the first 100 times, looking for the angle, the defense, the way to make himself the victim. He watched it the way you watch something when you have finally run out of other people to blame and there is no one left in the room to perform for. He watched himself point at a quiet old man in a worn jacket and call him a thief. He listened to his own voice, and for the first time he heard what everyone else had heard, the ugliness in it, the certainty, the cruelty wearing the mask of authority. He watched the old man stay calm. He watched him put his hands on the car without resisting. He watched the documents go down on the hood, and he heard the name spoken again. Keanu Reeves, and this time, alone, with nothing left to protect, he did the thing he had never once done in 28 years. He looked the man up. He sat in his room full of expensive objects, and he actually learned, for the first time, who Keanu Reeves was, watched the films he had never bothered with, read the 30 years of stories about a man revered not for his fame but for his kindness, the legendary decency, the man who treated every nobody like somebody. And Tyler Ashford understood, slowly and then all at once, that the person his entire upbringing had taught him to dismiss as a finished old nobody had been, in every way that actually mattered, a greater man than Tyler would ever be. And that the worth Tyler had spent his life measuring in watches and cars and names had been measured, the whole time, in exactly the wrong currency. And then he understood the other thing, the worst thing, the thing about the car. He found, because it was in the coverage now, the reason Keanu had bought the Silver Cloud, the story of a mechanic named Vernon, who had loved a car he could fix but never have, and a son who had bought it to honor him. And Tyler sat with the knowledge that the car he had been so enraged to lose, the car he believed had been stolen from him by an unworthy man, had never been about money or status at all, that while Tyler had wanted it as one more trophy, the man he had called a thief had wanted it as a way to love a dead father, and that Tyler had stood on a red carpet and tried to destroy a man for driving his father's memory to a party held in that man's honor. He sat with that alone, in his room full of things, and there was no one to perform for and no angle to find and no power left to summon. And for the first time in his life, Tyler Ashford saw himself clearly and understood what he was, and it was the loneliest moment of his life. And it had come far too late to save him, because the videos were already permanent, and the verdicts were already entered, and the town had already remembered, and the understanding did not undo a single one of those things. It only added to them the weight of finally knowing, which is a weight a man carries alone, in a quiet room with no one watching, forever. He never apologized to Keanu. Not because he did not by then want to, but because some part of him understood correctly that an apology at that point would be one more performance, one more attempt to make himself feel better at the expense of a man he had already wronged enough. And so the one decent instinct Tyler Ashford ever had was to spare Keanu Reeves the burden of his apology, and he kept his understanding to himself, and carried it, which was the only thing he had left that he could do that was not about himself. Keanu Reeves never sought any of it. He did not testify with relish. He did not give interviews. He did not celebrate the young man's fall. When it was reported to him, in the weeks after, that Tyler's career had collapsed and the charges had been filed, he received the news without satisfaction, because he had been on the other side of power his whole life long enough to take no joy in watching it crush someone, even someone who deserved it. He had done only one thing. On the night itself, that was a choice rather than a necessity, and it was the keys, handing the keys to Earl Tibbet, and everything else had simply been the natural consequence of Tyler Ashford colliding with the truth, which Keanu had not created, only survived. The asymmetry of it all remained, the way it always does. Earl Tibbet, the valet who had spoken up, was sought out by Keanu in the weeks that followed and offered a position managing guest services for a company Keanu had an interest in, a real job with a real office and real respect, and Earl took it, and it changed the last chapter of his working life, and that was a genuine good that came out of the night. Hector, the young valet who had been too frightened to speak, was not punished and was quietly reassured, and learned something about courage from having failed to show it, the way most of us learn it. Mara Quinn found that her late bravery served her well. But the older actors Tyler had humiliated over the years did not get their dignity back. Not really. The moments were gone. The small daily cruelties already absorbed into the bodies of the people who had suffered them, and no viral video undid those. And Vernon Reeves was still dead, and no reckoning on any red carpet brought him back or let him sit, even once, in the car his son had bought him, and that grief, the original grief underneath the whole story, was not resolved by any of it, because some things cannot be resolved, only honored. A few weeks after the premiere, on an ordinary afternoon, Keanu Reeves took the Silver Cloud out of its garage and drove it, alone, up into the hills, the way he did a few times a year. He did not turn on the radio. He drove slowly, with the windows down, and the car closed around him like a bank vault, quiet and solid, the way it had closed around a wealthy stranger in 1974, while a young mechanic named Vernon ran his oil-stained hands along the hand-finished wood, and told his boy that some things were built for one kind of man and admired by another. Keanu drove his father's car through the gold of the late afternoon, and somewhere on a quiet road with no one watching, he said, out loud, to a man who had been gone a long time, "You'd have loved it, Dad, the way the doors close." And he kept driving, and that, not the lawsuit, and not the verdict, and not the viral video, was the only thing about the entire affair that had ever actually mattered to him. I have told this story a number of times now, and people always want to talk about the moment on the red carpet, the documents on the hood, the name spoken aloud, the young man screaming about his father as his world came down. That was never the part that stayed with me. The part that stayed with me was the keys. The way Keanu, with the whole industry watching, and every reason to make a show of his vindication, took the keys to that irreplaceable car, the car that held his dead father inside it, and handed them not to a famous friend or a studio executive, but to Earl Tibbet, the 63-year-old valet, who had risked his job to speak an unwelcome truth and been dismissed in 2 seconds for it. He gave the most precious thing he owned, in that moment, to the one person present who had behaved with courage and gotten nothing for it. That is the whole of him, I think, in a single gesture. Tyler Ashford spent the night trying to prove who was important. Keanu spent 4 seconds showing who was worth honoring, and they were not the same thing, and they never are. And the difference between those two men was the difference between a person who has learned the names of the people who came before him and a person who never thought he needed to. While this story is fictional, the lessons about how the world sorts people by their surfaces and how completely it can be wrong are very real. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.